A woman was found dead in her home with 2 arrows protruding from her back. Her husband's gambling addiction raises some questions, but a mysterious note holds a valuable clue. Kitchens are where food is prepared, and they should be one of the cleanest places in a house. When Fiona's kitchen was found messy, it came as a shock to everyone.
Fiona was always a kind person and never had problems with anyone, which makes the situation so confusing and sad. She loved her job and minded her business. She was never able to secure a full-time job and had to stick with cleaning houses, which she took pride in.
Fiona worked with her friend Patty cleaning houses for clients.
Fiona and me have always been close. We clean most of our houses together, and she is just such a hard worker. I've really always admired her, but while I mostly just clean for the extra cash and just kind of something to keep me busy, Fiona really needed the money. Ever since her husband Jim had lost his job, she had to really start becoming more stressed out. I was concerned when she told me that she'd been picking up extra houses just for the extra money.
Fiona's husband, Jim, had worked in the Sharpsville mines for the past 6 years, since he graduated high school. Life as a miner is strenuous and not very rewarding, but Jim was a steady hard worker. A few months before the events took place, the Sharpsville mines were overdue for health and safety inspections. It was a shock to the town when the mine was declared unsafe and unsanitary, and there was a federal government-mandated shutdown imposed upon the mine, leaving dozens of miners unemployed.
Jim worked very hard at the mines, but when they were shut down, he was devastated. During his job search, he started to gamble, and at first it wasn't as often and as bad as it would come to be. When Jim would win a big hand or get a lucky pull at the slots, he would feel alive and always want to go again and never stop with the money he earned. After a while, Fiona caught on to what Jim was up to and wanted him to stop, but his addiction only got worse. Jim would have no money to gamble with, and he would resort to taking money from Fiona or taking out big loans that he would spend all on gambling. Ever since Jim started gambling, he and Fiona's relationship has been a little bit strained, but they were managing. My poor little sister worked extra hard to help them afloat.
Jim was constantly out betting on horses, races, or gambling at the casino. However, despite this addiction, Fiona and Jim appeared to be doing all right, until on June 16, 2003 at 7:44 p.m., the Sharpsville Police Department received a call from Jim.
When I got to the scene, I just distinctly remember how odd it seemed, as well as how brutal. She had 2 arrows, like old-fashioned bow and arrow arrows, sticking out of her back. Her head had a severe-looking injury on the back, and there was just a pool of blood all over the floor. Blood was splattered all on the cabinets, and there was broken glass, broken plates on the ground. There was money everywhere, all over the floor.
When the first responders arrived to the scene, they described what they saw as a common sign of struggle. The kitchen was messy. It seemed that the table was being set for dinner, but the act was interrupted by her murder. Strangely enough, there was a scatter of money around the room and several pieces of broken glass and ceramic ware. As forensics detective Timmy Logue mentioned earlier, there was a large pool of blood surrounding the victim's head. After the scene had been scoured, detectives were disappointed to find that there were no traceable fingerprints left on any of the pieces of evidence. The only traces of hair belonged to Fiona and Jim. But what baffled the investigators was what they found in their blood. Dun dun dun!
We got our results back from the lab that Fiona had this toxin in her system. I think it's called tetrodotoxin, and it causes paralysis. So our first thoughts were, was she poisoned and how did it get into her system? Well, no, the autopsy showed that she had almost an empty stomach, just a little bit of food from snacks in there. So she would have had to eat some kind of fish to get that through poisoning. Our next thoughts were, she didn't eat the fish or she didn't eat anything on accident, how did it get into her system? And we thought, were the arrows poisoned? And we came to the conclusion that this had to have been the means by which this substance got into her bloodstream.
Police had concluded that Fiona was at the sink preparing dinner when she was impaled through her back via an open window in her kitchen. Once she was paralyzed, the killer would be left with as much time as he wants to come in, take some money, and finish the job. But now that they had the how, they still needed to figure out the who. Several days after the crime scene was closed down, crime scene cleaners were scrubbing up Fiona's kitchen when they accidentally discovered perhaps the biggest clue which had been overlooked by the investigators.
In the initial searching, we completely missed the note that had been addressed to Jim. Actually, as ironic as it is, the cleaning team was the one who found it. And Fiona cleaned for a living, but it was hidden beneath a little spice cabinet. And this note was important. It was the first thing that really gave us a clue as to what actually went down.
Detectives noticed that the contents of the letter seemed quite unusual. The most important piece of evidence that was found at the crime scene was the letter to Jim. The letter was found under a cabinet and was overlooked in the initial search of the room. It read, "Jim, get your act together. You will regret your choices very soon. You will get what is coming to you, and so will we." The letter is especially short, which is odd when dealing with threats, which the note clearly is. One would expect a specific figure to be given concerning the repayment of a debt. If Jim were in debt, it would be expected that the one who was owed money would specify the amount and possibly give a time frame, in which case, there's neither. The letter appeared as though it wasn't written by someone who Jim actually owed money. So, the next step was to figure out just who it was who wrote the note. And handwriting specialists found a shocking answer. When we compared samples of the notes of Fiona's handwriting and that of Fiona's friends, we ruled them out. But when we compared against some of Jim's handwriting, we found the notes writing to be almost identical. Since Jim wrote his own name in the letter, we were able to say with confidence his writing and his name matched the signature to a T.
Handwriting analysis finally gave the police a solid direction. Once they found out it matched with Jim's own handwriting, they decided to bring him in for questioning, along with several other people who might have been involved. The challenge police faced was with Jim's alibi, which held up very soundly. Jim had been at the track, dressed in a fine suit and gambling attire. There are records of his bets at the track. Also, his nice dress shoes had no evidence of being used to stomp in a human skull. And he was the one who made the 911 call without any cleanup attempt. So police were only left with this note linking him to the crime. This led them to believe that there had been another party involved. When police officer Craig Sandy was questioned about Jim, some of his remarks raised questions about fellow officer Stephen George.
Whenever I would talk to Jim about his problem getting help, he would get defensive and angry, yelling at me that he had it under control, and that Stephen was handling him. I found it so odd that Jim hated me, but was so fond of Stephen like that.
Stephen George was the officer that knew his way around town like the back of his hand. Considering his rank on the force, Officer George was often the one responding to calls and reports of disturbance. Everyone on the force knew him for his productivity and servitude. Around the months before the Fiona murder case, George spent a hefty amount of his nights watching over the casino Jim attended. The owners often had to call him in for scuffles that started amongst the tables he would play at. Jim's winning streaks were dwindling in such a fashion and frequency that he would throw fits. detectives decided to go interview the owners of the places Jim frequented. They learned some interesting new information.
Something seemed low-key fishy about those two. George was here every other night, coming to pull his ass out of here. I was close to banning him from the building. If it weren't for his business, he wouldn't be in here causing such a ruckus. But that cop and that guy, Jim seemed a little off, like they were too close for comfort, more than any two guys should be.
After detectives got this lead, they decided to search George's house. There, they were shocked to find many of Jim's belongings, including clothes, toiletries, just like you might find at a boyfriend or a girlfriend's house.
We were absolutely stunned when we saw all of Jim's stuff at Steve and George's house. He had soap, he had a toothbrush, he had his deodorant, he had a bunch of clothes and some shoes. And the only reasonable explanation to come up with was that they were sleeping together or partners in some way.
Also discovered in George's house was an archery bow, one that could have been used to fire the arrows that immobilized Fiona. And finally, when George's computer was searched, they found that he had ordered tetrodotoxin, the very same substance that was in Fiona's blood.
With the evidence we uncovered at George's, we finally had enough to build a case and go to court. We discovered Jim had been borrowing money from George, and George wanted Jim to leave Fiona for him, and he'd forgive him his debts since he'd be living with him and they'd be partners. But when Jim couldn't make up his mind and pick one, paying George back or leaving Fiona, George made the decision for him.
The prosecutors believed Fiona was making dinner for her and Jim to eat when Jim got back from the track gambling. Through an open window, Officer Stephen George shot Fiona in the back with tetrodotoxin-covered arrows. The toxin paralyzed Fiona and she dropped her dishes and knocked her glass over. George then was able to climb through the window and finish her with a stomp on the back of her skull. Jim got home later, saw what had happened, and wrote the note and scattered his winnings to cover for George, his lover. The jury found Officer Stephen George guilty of murder in the 3rd degree. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Jim was charged with obstruction of justice and crime scene tampering and sentenced to 18 years in prison.
I've seen a few despicable acts in my life, and violence out of love and money is almost always the motive. In this case, it seemed both forces worked hand in hand.